The Golden State is facing an unprecedented crisis. After a 4.5-year legal battle, California's independent trucking industry has effectively surrendered. Nearly 70,000 owner-operators, small business truckers who spent decades building their livelihoods, are being forced out almost overnight. Dispatch centers across the state lit up with urgent calls and emails. Landstar, one of the nation's largest carriers, sent a blunt message. California is too risky. Audits, fines, and retroactive penalties threaten anyone still operating in the state. Independent truckers, many of whom invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in rigs, insurance, and permits, suddenly faced a stark choice. Comply with AB 5 and become employees, losing autonomy and income potential, or leave California entirely. Conversations that once focused on securing the next shipment quickly shifted to survival. Carrier offices made swift calculations, deciding it was safer to forfeit California business than risk six-figure penalties years down the line. The industry was not waiting for enforcement letters. The impact was immediate, in the day-to-day decisions of companies and drivers. Assembly Bill 5, signed into law in September 2019, lies at the heart of the upheaval. Its ABC test determines whether a worker qualifies as an independent contractor or must be reclassified as an employee. The first prong, freedom from company control, often fits truckers. The third, operating an established trade, also fits since most operators invest heavily in their rigs and run their own business. But the second prong, the infamous B prong, requires the work to be outside the usual course of the hiring company's business. For truckers hauling freight for motor carriers, this is impossible. The law presumes they are employees with no room for negotiation. Other professions, such as doctors and engineers, received carve-outs. Truckers did not. For 70,000 owner-operators, decades of independence evaporated with a single clause. Every number represents a person who gambled on themselves, their families, and their trucks. Vehicles worth over $150,000, financed through years of savings or family loans, suddenly cannot operate independently. For carriers, converting drivers to employees is far from simple. Payroll taxes, health insurance, paid leave, and workers' compensation now fall on their books. A single truck can add tens of thousands of dollars in annual costs. Multiply that across dozens of drivers, and small and mid-sized fleets find themselves financially incapable of complying. Faced with this reality, truckers have a bitter choice: give up independence or leave California. This isn't a theoretical debate. For drivers, it is the difference between maintaining a livelihood and seeing decades of investment evaporate. Within days, highways, back roads, and distribution centers reflected the impact. Trucks once hauling produce from the Central Valley to Los Angeles sat idle. Drivers described it as someone flipping a switch. One week they worked normally, the next week their phones were silent. Families dependent on trucking income faced uncertainty. Vehicles financed over decades sat idle, accruing costs, while the legal and economic reality sank in. As the fallout spreads across California, the human toll becomes impossible to ignore. Owner-operators who once thrived on independence now face empty dispatch boards, silent phones, and a looming decision: adapt or abandon their livelihoods. One veteran driver described the moment vividly. One week, I was hauling produce from the Central Valley. The next week, nothing. My phone stopped ringing. It was like someone flipped a switch. Families who relied on trucking income to pay mortgages, tuition, and bills now struggle to plan for the next month. Every mile not driven translates into lost revenue, and every delay compounds the anxiety for households already stretched thin. It is not just drivers feeling the pressure. Carrier offices across the state are reevaluating operations, trimming fleets, and refusing California loads to avoid potential fines. Landstar's advisory was just the first of many. Independent truckers across Los Angeles, Sacramento, Fresno, and San Diego now scramble to find alternative employment or relocate to other states. Small fleet owners face payroll obligations they cannot afford, while larger carriers weigh the financial risk of retaining drivers under the law's constraints. The cumulative effect threatens California's supply chain in ways few anticipated. Ports, highways, and warehouses are all beginning to feel the strain. Los Angeles and Long Beach ports, handling nearly 40% of the nation's imported containers, rely on a constant flow of trucks to move goods from cranes to warehouses. With owner-operators departing and small carriers hesitant to take California loads, cargo is piling up. Shipping companies quietly shift contracts to Texas and East Coast ports. Logistics managers warn of delays, unpredictable delivery schedules, and rising freight costs. Emergency services in rural counties, dependent on fuel and local trucking, are forced to drive extra miles to refuel, stretching response times for fires and medical emergencies. The legislation itself, Assembly Bill 5, remains at the center of the storm. The B prong of the ABC test, designed to reclassify contractors whose work is part of a company's core business, has stripped independence from thousands. Unlike other professions, truckers were not given exemptions. The fallout is structural, affecting not only individuals, but an entire industry that forms the backbone of California's economy. Fuel stations, distribution centers, and logistics companies now brace for a domino effect as independent drivers vanish. The uncertainty fuels anxiety for families and workers alike, amplifying the ripple effect. Now, consider the personal impact. What would happen if your livelihood disappeared overnight? How would your family survive if every effort, every investment, evaporated in an instant? These are the questions facing tens of thousands of Californians today. And the answers are not theoretical. They are unfolding on highways, in warehouses, and at ports across the state. The exodus of drivers creates gaps in supply, delays shipments, and drives costs higher for every business and consumer who relies on timely deliveries. What would you do if your business or job vanished overnight because of a law? Could you survive, or would you be forced to leave? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your perspective. As 2026 begins, California's highways and ports feel the crunch of a disappearing trucking workforce. Owner-operators have left the state. Small carriers refuse loads, and the consequences ripple through every corner of the economy. Gas stations in rural towns are closing, leaving long stretches of highway without fuel. Trucks still on the road are forced to plan routes around these fuel deserts, adding hours and costs to every delivery. Families dependent on freight income face uncertainty as the opportunities to earn a living in the state vanish. What was once predictable, the rhythm of shipments, paychecks, and deliveries, is now chaotic. Ports like Los Angeles and Long Beach, critical gateways for nearly 40% of the nation's imports, are particularly vulnerable. Containers pile up in terminal yards as fewer trucks arrive to transport them. Shipping companies, wary of delays and costs, reroute cargo to Texas and East Coast ports. Warehouses sit half-empty, store shelves risk shortages, and freight costs climb. The impact extends beyond logistics. Emergency responders, construction crews, and local businesses now operate under a new reality, where fuel scarcity and limited trucking access are daily obstacles. Small towns once connected by reliable trucking routes now feel isolated, and the strain on families grows. Fuel is at the heart of this crisis. With major refineries like Phillips 66's Los Angeles plant shuttered and Valero preparing to close, California has lost more than 17% of its refining capacity in less than a year. Diesel for trucks, gasoline for cars, and heating fuel for homes are all at risk. Owner-operators and carriers can no longer rely on local supplies, and the state lacks infrastructure to import fuel efficiently. Tankers arriving from other states or overseas face weeks of transport, port delays, and testing before reaching inland destinations. Each mile adds cost. Every delay means higher prices at the pump, putting extra strain on families already struggling to cover basic expenses. For small business truckers, the financial impact is staggering. Vehicles financed over decades sit idle, yet expenses like insurance, maintenance, and loan payments continue. Drivers describe sleepless nights calculating whether they can survive another month without income. Families dependent on trucking are forced to stretch savings, cut non-essential spending, or leave the state entirely. Meanwhile, carriers who attempt to convert independent drivers to employees face massive payroll burdens. Taxes, health insurance, and workers' compensation costs for dozens or hundreds of drivers quickly add up, making small and mid-sized fleets financially unviable. Beyond the financial strain lies a human story. Truckers speak of losing identity along with income. Independence, the core of their livelihood, has been stripped away by policy. Generations of families built around trucking find themselves forced to adapt to a reality that seems unrecognizable. Rural communities, where truck stops and fuel stations were hubs of economic life, now feel the absence. Local economies shrink, schools and small businesses feel the ripple, and the social fabric of these regions begins to fray. The government, policymakers, and corporate risk managers watch as the dominoes fall. But the public, especially working families and commuters, bear the brunt of immediate impact. Fuel shortages, rising prices, and transportation delays become daily stressors. Californians are learning, the hard way, that policy decisions on paper have real-world consequences, and no one is immune. California's trucking and fuel crisis is no longer a prediction. It is a reality unfolding in real time. Owner-operators have fled, small carriers refuse California loads, and highways show the visible signs of a system under stress. Rural communities face longer drives to the nearest open gas station, while urban centers brace for delayed deliveries and rising prices. Families, commuters, and small business owners now feel the consequences of policies that, while intended to protect workers, have inadvertently disrupted livelihoods and supply chains. Every shipment delayed, every container stuck at port, translates into higher costs that land directly in consumer wallets. Ports, long the pride of California's economy, are struggling to adapt. Los Angeles and Long Beach, gateways for nearly 40% of the country's imports, now experience congestion as fewer trucks are available to move cargo inland. Shipping companies redirect contracts to ports in Texas, Georgia, and the East Coast, bypassing California entirely. Warehouses remain understocked, and retailers anticipate shortages. Freight costs rise sharply as the remaining trucking capacity becomes scarce. Consumers may feel it in higher grocery bills, delayed online orders, and fluctuating fuel prices. The impact is systemic, touching every sector reliant on transportation. Fuel shortages are compounding the problem. Major refineries, including Phillips 66's Los Angeles plant and Valero's Bonilla facility, have removed hundreds of thousands of barrels per day from the state's supply. Diesel, gasoline, and heating fuels are affected. The lack of local refining capacity leaves California dependent on imports from other states or overseas. Transporting fuel across long distances adds cost, time, and uncertainty. Prices at the pump spike, stretching family budgets. Rural drivers, long-haul truckers, and small business owners face the double burden of increased operating costs and fewer opportunities to earn income. The human side of the crisis is stark. Generations of truckers built businesses around independence. They financed rigs, insurance, and permits with the expectation of self-reliance. Now, decades of work vanish under the weight of AB5's B-prong, forcing them to either give up independence or leave California. Families face tough choices: relocate, reduce expenses, or risk financial collapse. Local economies shrink as truck stops close and supply chains tighten. Community centers, schools, and small businesses feel the ripple effect, and the social fabric of many towns begins to fray. California policymakers now face a critical question: how to stabilize the industry without undoing labor protections. Solutions may include phased implementation, exemptions for independent truckers, or infrastructure to support fuel distribution and trucking operations. Without action, families and businesses will continue to bear the brunt of this crisis. Emergency responders, construction crews, and delivery services are already adjusting routes, driving further distances to secure fuel, and coping with delays that affect daily life. The numbers tell a compelling story. Tens of thousands of trucks have left California. Hundreds of fuel stations have shuttered. Ports handle fewer containers. Warehouses run short on goods, and families stretch budgets to cover rising fuel and freight costs. Every day of delay adds economic and human cost. Yet, these are not distant statistics. They are the lived reality of Californians today, and the consequences are accelerating. How would you adapt if your livelihood, commute, or business depended on trucks and fuel that suddenly became scarce? Could you survive the economic ripple effects? Share your experience in the comments below. I want to hear from you. If you want to stay updated on California's trucking crisis, port delays, and fuel shortages, and understand how it may affect your family and wallet, subscribe now and hit the bell. The story is far from over, and the next chapter could hit closer to home than you think.